Here is Sailor Colorado, a purple ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This is a sheening purple. Now, the sheen is in the swatch and in my notes taken on Tomoe River paper, but not anywhere else. There is a bunch of tone variation by pen, and it does frequently shade, but as sheening inks do, it can easily be reactivated by the moisture of your hand, even on non-fountain pen friendly paper. And on non-fountain pen friendly paper, it does perform relatively the same as it does on the better stuff. Now, as a sheening ink, I don't go for it and can easily pass up a bottle, but it is a great dark purple on the page. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is
A Lamy Safari. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice darker purple from a really dry pen. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it has a wealth of shading that's going on. Take a look at wealth on the second line. Mostly a nice darker purple, very dark with the H at the end, just like underneath it where the LI are a nice dark purple, but the KE at the end become very dark. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade, and looking at it very carefully, I'm not seeing the sheen come through on this Clairfontaine paper, making me a bit disappointed considering it should be a sheening ink. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, and it does it in a fairly decent way. Take a look at excitement. First word, first line. The E is, of course, a dark, but the X gets very dark into that C. It lightens just a little bit to only a dark purple with the I. The T becomes darker, lightening just a little bit on the EM. The next E, very dark, N lightening, T, very dark. Such great shading going on. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade, though nowhere near as well as it did with that medium nib. But you can see some areas of it, like the on the first line, where the TH is fairly light. The E at the end is very dark, as is the cross of the T at the top. Now, bridges is mostly a dark tone, but it's the top of the B that is quite a bit darker. Same with the downstroke of that D and the S at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, not to be stopped by this more absorbent paper. Take a look at stopped on the second line. We're mostly a dark tone, but both the P's and the D are a bit darker. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. It also doesn't sheen. Not that I would expect it on this paper, but it does smear if you touch it. even the day after you wrote it. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. You could find it without too many problems. Take a look at could on the first line, where the COU are the lighter tone that is putting down, where the LD at the end does get much faster. Now, I do feel like I'm rushing through some of this when we look at rushing on the second line. The RU are lighter. It's the S that starts to get a little bit darker, but the hing at the end, quite dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is about the same tone as it was with the medium. Same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. Yes, it does shade. Brightly, I might say. Take a look at bright on the first line, where most all of the word is just a dark tone. The T at the end does get quite a bit darker. Now, underneath it, the T is a little lighter than the H, and the E at the end even darker than the H. Now, most is mostly a darker tone with the MOS at the beginning, but that T at the end does get quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we can see that the ink gets very deep into this paper. In some cases, like the soft fine, I think you could write back there. The wet fine, there's quite a bit of ghosting, same with the medium and the broad. Now on the other side, the page underneath, it was the medium that bled the tiniest dot through, touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Now, I think the darker tone that we're seeing here is a result of the tone of the paper, showing that this is a little translucent as an ink. Also, while it is a little darker, it's also very purple about it. It's not making it black purple, but it is very purple. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but really showing that purple coming through, again being from the tone of the paper. Now, it doesn't feather and it doesn't spread, it does not shade, just as it did not on the Clairfontaine. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, and it's not awful about how it does it. Take a look at awful on the second line, where the A and beginning of the W are very dark. During the second part of the W into the F, it lightens just a little bit. That F becomes very dark. The U lightens up a little bit, and that L at the end, very dark. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium. It is just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, but different. It's like showing almost as if there were a blue undertone, which I don't believe that this ink has. I don't remember that. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have some shading, not huge amounts, not the standout thing. Definitely there. You can see it in swept on the first line, where the PT is much darker than the rest of the work. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and continue to write on the back of the page with no problems.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out from the quad rule without any kind of a problem. Not that I was really expecting any problems here. I think this is a good combination. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. The same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does not shade. It does put a beautiful, very dark, almost black purple onto the page. In that, it is outstanding. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. You know, it's swept back a little bit in what's happening. That was a horrible tie-in. Take a look at swept back on the first line, where the SWE are lighter than the PT at the end, but even the bottom of that T is a little lighter than it was at the top. Now back, the B and the K at the beginning and end are both darker than the AC in the middle. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade fairly well, I think about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. If we take a look at, and I'm not going to try and work this into it, shafts on the first line, the SA is quite a bit darker than the SH is quite a bit darker than the AFTS at the end. Now, fell right next to that, the top of the F is lighter than the bottom of the F. Lightens a little bit more into the E. First L a little bit darker than the second L. Really interesting. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ancient Charm, Grief on Jade Steps. Here is Diamine Lilac Night. Here is Lamy Beryl. Here is Private Reserve DC Super Show Violet.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Really surprised to see that. Normally this paper is going to dull it a little bit, but this ink is strong with the force and keeps the same tone with no feathering, with no spread, with shading about as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out from the quad rule without any problems, which makes it great for students. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. Little bit darker, strangely, than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, doesn't shade. While the tone is great, and I know that I said it's good for a student, not good for a student in a lab because it is a sheen and it will reactivate and smear from the moisture in your hand. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, even lighter than it was from the broad on the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade about as well, but doesn't get nearly as dark in the areas as some of the other nibs. I mean, if you take a look at Archers on the second line, you see the H is the darkest letter in the word. Most words come out as a fairly uniform tone, as if they've been ordered to. Look at Order on the third line, where the D is darker than the rest of the word, but it's fighting to get some of this shade out, like when you look at Fight on the third line, all one tone the whole way through. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have some shading, little shading, like it did on the medium on this paper. I mean, lightning, you see it with the G and the H, some. Same with the T at the top, a little bit. Shores on the third line, the H is darker than the rest of it, but mostly we're getting some of the lightest purple that we've had of this ink. Looking at the back of the page, though, there's no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Jeherban Emerald of Chavour. Here is Pen BBS number 130. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Electric Pink. Here is Pilot Mixable Yellow.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Of course, it feathers. Of course, it spreads. Yes, there's some shading. That doesn't matter because this is copy paper. What we're really concerned with is this usable? And I think here we have something that's usable, not perfect. I mean, it can be distracting at times, like then the feathering there is just very distracting. But the majority of it, I think, is passable, so you could use it if you wanted to. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it doesn't shade. It's not usable to me. The feathering and the spread that goes on make it cross that boundary to the point that it becomes distracting, and you might have written something important to me, but I'm probably not seeing it because I'm just being that picky about it, but I don't like how this looks at all. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than on the Clairfontaine, lighter than even the broad on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. It does have just the lightest peppering of shading. Not that that matters. Is this usable on this paper? And I'm going to say generally yes, although I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't fault someone for it. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the medium, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Of course, it feathers. Of course, it spreads. No, it does not shade. No, I don't think this is usable. The spread, granted, my penmanship's never the best, but I don't think it's horrible. I think it makes it look worse. I'd have rather been writing with a purple Sharpie. Looking at the back of the page, you can see just how deep this ink was getting into the paper. The whole way through, you could practically read it from the back side. It didn't bleed through to the other side, which is good news, I guess, in that case.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine is a dark tone that shades the best. Now the wet fine is super dark, almost to a black purple, and rarely shades. The medium is a bit lighter than the wet fine and shades better. The broad is a lot lighter than the medium and does shade fairly well. Ah, the advantages of multiple pens. I go for a dry fine to extra fine because it gives great tone and shades extremely well. But for tone alone, I would go with a wet pen, like a wet fine, wet medium. I don't care, wet stub. Very wet's going to put down a super dark tone. If it wasn't for the reactivation of the sheen, I think this would be perfect like that.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.